The Federal Trade Commission filed its largest antitrust case in decades against Amazon in 2023, and Lina Khan, the FTC chair who literally wrote the book on Amazon's monopoly power in her Yale Law Journal paper, Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, is now leading the charge to break it up. She's going to fail. And a conservation biologist who died in 2021 could have told her exactly why. The most dangerous business strategy of the 21st century wasn't invented in Silicon Valley, wasn't developed at Harvard Business School, and wasn't theorized by economists or modeled by MBAs. 55 million years of evolution in the Amazon basin perfected it, and Jeff Bezos just copied it. None of this is metaphor. Amazon, the company, doesn't just feel like a rainforest, and Bezos didn't simply think of his company as an ecosystem when he built it. The actual structural mechanics that make tropical rainforests nearly impossible to destroy are the exact same mechanics that make Amazon, the company, nearly impossible to compete with. Once you understand why rainforests work the way they do, you'll see why Lina Khan's antitrust framework is bringing a chainsaw to fight the weather. What the FTC, business journalists, and even Amazon's fiercest critics don't understand is that Amazon isn't a predator, because predators can be killed. Amazon is a climate, and you can't sue the climate. The actual jungle spans 6.7 million square kilometers across 9 countries, including Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guyana. Roughly 10% of all species on Earth live there, with an estimated 80,000 plant species, 1,300 bird species, 3,000 types of fish, and more insect species than scientists can count. Thomas Lovejoy, the conservation biologist who coined the term biological diversity in 1980 and spent his career studying this ecosystem until his death in 2021, called it the lungs of the Earth. His colleague E.O. Wilson, the Harvard entomologist who changed our understanding of biodiversity through his work on ant colonies as superorganisms, considered it the most complex system on the planet. That nickname undersells what's actually happening there. Most people assume rainforests are rich because of great soil, but the opposite is true. Amazonian soil is thin, acidic, and nutrient depleted. Clear-cut a section of rainforest and try to farm it, and you'll get maybe 2 or 3 years of decent crops before the land becomes nearly useless. This confused European colonizers for centuries. Manaus, the city deep in the Brazilian Amazon, boomed during the rubber trade and then collapsed when plantations elsewhere outcompeted it, which raises the question of how the most abundant ecosystem on the planet could grow from the worst soil. The answer changed how we understand biology, and it's about to change how you understand business. Rainforests don't extract nutrients from the soil at all. Instead, they create a closed-loop system where nutrients almost never touch the ground. When a leaf falls in the Amazon, it doesn't decompose slowly into the dirt like it would in a temperate forest, and within weeks, or sometimes days, fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates break that leaf down completely. A dense network of shallow roots and mycorrhizal fungi, what scientists now call the wood wide web, immediately absorbs those nutrients and pumps them directly back up into living plants. Nothing leaks and nothing wastes. The forest recycles itself so efficiently that it generates its own weather. Trees pull groundwater up through their roots and release it through transpiration, a process where a single large tree can release 1,000 liters of water vapor per day. That moisture forms clouds, which create rain, which feeds the trees, which create more clouds. Research published in Nature found that the Amazon generates roughly 50% of its own rainfall, which means it's not just growing in an environment, but creating the environment it needs to grow. Scientists call this a closed nutrient loop, and it has a terrifying implication. Once a rainforest reaches a certain density and complexity, it becomes self-sustaining in a way that's almost impossible to reverse. The forest doesn't need the outside world anymore, and the outside world increasingly needs the forest. Jeff Bezos didn't name his company after a river because it sounded exotic. His 1,997 letter to shareholders, still required reading in business schools, described wanting to build an enduring franchise that would be impossible for others to replicate. He talked about obsessing over customers and investing for the long term. What he didn't say publicly, but what becomes obvious when you study Amazon's actual structure, is that he was building a closed-loop system, and Andy Jassy, who built AWS from scratch and took over as CEO in 2021, has only tightened those loops. Rainforests cycle nutrients, and Amazon cycles cash. AWS generated over $85 billion in revenue in 2023 and operates at roughly 30% operating margins, while retail operates at razor-thin margins, sometimes negative. Profits from AWS flow directly into subsidizing lower retail prices, faster delivery, and infrastructure investments. The money never leaves the system and just circulates, growing the whole organism. Rainforests have the mycorrhizal network, those fungal threads connecting trees underground that allow them to share resources, send chemical signals, and support weaker members of the forest. Amazon has Prime. Over 200 million members pay annual fees that subsidize everything from free shipping to streaming video to music streaming to grocery delivery through Whole Foods. Prime members don't just buy more, because they're connected to the system in a way that makes leaving almost unthinkable. The switching costs aren't financial but infrastructural. Cancel Prime and you don't lose a subscription, you lose the architecture of your daily life. Rainforests have symbiotic relationships, species that can't survive without each other. The Brazil nut tree can only be pollinated by a specific orchid bee, which can only survive in undisturbed rainforest. Cut down the forest, lose the bee, lose the tree, and one of the Amazon's most valuable exports disappears. Amazon has third-party sellers. Over 60% of Amazon's retail sales now come from independent sellers using fulfillment by Amazon. These businesses, from Anchor, now a billion-dollar electronics brand, to millions of smaller operations, have optimized their entire operations around Amazon's infrastructure. Their inventory sits in Amazon's warehouses, their logistics run on Amazon's trucks, and their customer service uses Amazon's systems. Leaving would mean rebuilding everything from scratch while competing against the platform they just abandoned. The mechanism is identical, and only the materials are different. Rainforests aren't just collections of individual species competing for resources, and most people don't realize that. They're integrated systems where competition and cooperation blur into something else entirely. Ecologists call this emergent complexity, the idea that the whole system has properties that none of its individual parts possess. A single tree doesn't create rainfall, and a single fungal network doesn't cycle nutrients. But the forest, operating as a unified system, does things no single organism could do alone. Stuart Kaufman at the Santa Fe Institute calls these autocatalytic sets systems that create the conditions for their own existence. Amazon operates the same way. AWS doesn't just host websites, but provides the computational infrastructure that thousands of companies depend on to exist. Capital One runs on AWS, Samsung runs on AWS, and the CIA runs on AWS. Amazon Marketplace doesn't just sell products, but provides the commercial infrastructure that millions of businesses depend on to reach customers. Amazon Logistics doesn't just deliver packages, but is becoming the delivery infrastructure that even competitors like UPS and FedEx sometimes have to work within. Each piece is valuable alone. Together, they create something no competitor can replicate, which is the environment itself. Three specific principles that ecologists have understood for decades, and that business strategists are only beginning to grasp, explain how this plays out. The first principle is what ecologists call layered canopy structure. Mature rainforests don't have just one level of vegetation, but at least four distinct layers. The emergent layer holds the tallest trees that break above the main canopy and can reach 60 meters. The canopy layer forms the dense ceiling of interlocking branches that captures 99% of sunlight. The understory contains smaller trees and shrubs that survive on filtered light. The forest floor holds fungi, decomposers, and shade-tolerant plants that break down organic matter. Each layer creates the conditions for the layers below it. Emergent trees break the wind and modulate temperature. The canopy creates humidity and shade, and the understory filters what reaches the floor. Remove any layer, and the layers below it collapse. AWS represents the emergent layer at Amazon. It's the highest margin, most visible to investors part of the business, the trees that rise above everything else. 32% of the global cloud market belongs to AWS, more than Microsoft, Azure, and Google Cloud combined. When companies like Netflix, Airbnb, or even the CIA need computing infrastructure, they build on AWS, which creates what tech analysts call dependency moats. Companies running on AWS have invested millions into architecture, specifically optimized for Amazon systems, and migrating to Azure or Google Cloud would cost more than starting over. They're not customers anymore, but organisms that have evolved to live in Amazon's environment. Prime represents the canopy layer. It's the dense coverage that most customers interact with, the thing that defines what the Amazon experience feels like. 2-day shipping, 1-day shipping, same-day shipping in some cities. Video streaming that rivals Netflix, music streaming, prescription delivery through Amazon Pharmacy, grocery delivery through Whole Foods and Amazon Fresh, exclusive deals on Whole Foods products, Ring doorbell integration, Alexa everywhere. Each benefit interlocks with the others. Cancel Prime. And you don't just lose free shipping, but the entire ecosystem of conveniences that you've organized your life around. The marketplace represents the understory. Third-party sellers operate in Amazon's shade, getting access to Amazon's 300 million active customers, Amazon's logistics, Amazon's trust signals, and Amazon's search ranking. In return, they pay fees that often reach 30–40% of their revenue, they share data, and they strengthen the overall system. What they provide is selection that becomes effectively infinite without Amazon having to invest infinite capital in inventory. The data layer represents the forest floor. Every click, every purchase, every search query, every abandoned cart, and every product return decomposes into information that feeds back into the system. Amazon's A9 search algorithm, its recommendation engines, its inventory predictions, its advertising platform, and its private label decisions through Amazon Basics all grow from the decomposed behavior of hundreds of millions of users. Even returns feed the system, because a returned product gets processed, repackaged, resold through Amazon Warehouse, or broken down for parts. Nothing leaks and nothing wastes. Remove AWS, and the whole system loses its oxygen. Remove Prime, and the canopy thins. Remove the marketplace, and selection shrinks. Remove the data, and the intelligence dies. Each layer also protects the others, and that's the truly terrifying part. AWS profits allow Amazon to subsidize marketplace growth, Prime membership justifies marketplace investment, and marketplace data improves AWS services. The system doesn't have a single point of failure because it's not a hierarchy but an ecology. The second principle is called keystone species dynamics. A keystone species in ecology is one whose impact on the ecosystem is disproportionately large relative to its abundance. Remove it, and the whole system reorganizes, usually into something much simpler and less diverse. The classic example is the sea otter on the Pacific coast. Sea otters eat sea urchins, and sea urchins eat kelp. Remove the otters, which fur traders nearly did in the 18th century, and urchins explode in population, kelp forests disappear, and hundreds of species that depended on kelp habitat vanish. The otter didn't make up a large percentage of the ecosystem's biomass, but it was holding the entire structure together. AWS represents the keystone species at Amazon, but not for the obvious reason. AWS generates most of Amazon's profits, over $20 billion in operating income annually. But here's the thing. AWS is the thing that other companies can't afford to compete against because doing so would mean competing against themselves. When Amazon launched AWS in 2006, it wasn't obvious that cloud computing would become essential infrastructure, and most big tech companies had their own data centers. They could have built their own cloud services and competed directly with AWS, and some eventually did, including Microsoft with Azure and Google with Cloud Platform. They were years late, and the reason was that building cloud infrastructure is expensive, and Amazon was willing to operate at losses that other companies couldn't justify to shareholders. Amazon's core retail business provided cover. As long as the overall company grew, Bezos could subsidize AWS development almost indefinitely, which is the nutrient cycling principle again, with profits from one part of the forest feeding growth in another. The keystone dynamic worked like this. By the time competitors realized AWS would become critical infrastructure, many of their future customers were already building on Amazon, and Amazon could use AWS profits to subsidize retail prices that those same competitors, especially in retail, couldn't match. Google sells products through Google Shopping, and Microsoft sells products through their store, and both of them are trying to compete with Amazon Retail while their potential customers are funding Amazon Retail through AWS fees. It's like trying to compete with a tree while paying rent to live in its shade. The keystone species doesn't just hold the ecosystem together, but makes the ecosystem dependent on its continued existence, even among those who would benefit most from its removal. The third principle is what ecologists call recruitment limitation and incumbent advantage. New species in rainforests have an incredibly hard time establishing themselves, not because they can't survive in the environment, but because every resource is already being used. Existing canopy captures light, existing organisms lock up nutrients, and existing roots and trunks occupy physical space. A seed that germinates on the forest floor faces overwhelming competition from organisms that are already there, already connected to the mycorrhizal network, and already adapted to local conditions. Disturbance is the only way new species really establish in mature rainforests. A tree falls, creates a light gap, and suddenly there's an opportunity for something new. Mature rainforests are surprisingly resistant to disturbance, though. Their diversity itself provides resilience, because if one species struggles with a pathogen, 10 others fill its niche. And if drought stresses one layer, others provide shade and moisture retention. Recruitment limitation at Amazon works through something Bezos explicitly cultivated called the flywheel effect, but calling it a flywheel undersells what's actually happening. A flywheel is mechanical, and this is thermodynamic, like a hurricane. Lower prices attract more customers attract more sellers mean more selection and competition, which drives lower prices, and lower prices attract more customers. Once it reaches critical mass, it generates its own energy, and trying to stop it just feeds it more. Scale alone doesn't explain this, integration does. A new competitor doesn't just need to match Amazon's prices, but needs to match Amazon's selection, which means recruiting millions of sellers who have already optimized for Amazon. They need to match Amazon's delivery speed, which means building hundreds of fulfillment centers that Amazon spent 2 decades constructing. They need to match Amazon's Prime benefits, which means creating a content library, a music service, a pharmacy, and a grocery store. Each element of Amazon's business makes every other element stronger and makes the barrier to entry exponentially higher. Walmart tried $3.3 billion, went to buying Jet.com in 2016, and they hired Mark Law, considered one of the best e-commerce minds in the industry. Billions more went into e-commerce infrastructure. They have more physical stores than anyone, with 4,700 locations within 10 miles of 90% of Americans. And they have logistical expertise that rivals Amazon's. What they've gained is single-digit market share in e-commerce, compared to Amazon's roughly 40%. Jet.com was shut down in 2020, and Law left in 2021. Walmart isn't failing to try, but trying to build a forest by planting trees, while Amazon didn't plant trees but became the climate. Shopify tried a different approach and built an anti-Amazon ecosystem for independent sellers. They've done well, with over $200 billion in gross merchandise volume. Shopify merchants still have to compete with Amazon for customer attention, though, and often end up selling on Amazon Marketplace anyway because that's where the customers are. Shopify didn't build an alternative forest, but built greenhouses, valuable and growing, but ultimately dependent on a climate they don't control. Even Alibaba, which dominates e-commerce in China, hasn't cracked the American market. Amazon's ecosystem was too established, too integrated, and too self-reinforcing. Recruitment limitation works both ways, making it hard to get in, but also hard to expand out if someone else has already become the environment. Every regulatory conversation about Amazon misses the point for exactly this reason. Lina Khan's framework, the one that made her famous and the one that's now driving FTC policy, treats Amazon as a predator, engaging in anti-competitive behavior. Her thesis holds that Amazon uses its platform dominance to unfairly disadvantage competitors, that it cross-subsidizes businesses to undercut rivals, and that it leverages data asymmetries to copy successful products. All of that is true, and none of it matters. Khan's framework assumes Amazon is a tree that's grown too large and is blocking sunlight from other trees, and the remedy in that framework is to cut the tree down to size. Break off AWS, spin out Marketplace, separate Prime, and let light reach the forest floor so new competitors can grow. Amazon isn't a tree, though. It's the forest. And you can't break up a forest. You can only burn it down. Burning down a rainforest doesn't give you fertile farmland, but degraded soil that takes centuries to recover, if it ever does. The Amazon basin has lost roughly 17% of its forest cover in the last 50 years, primarily to agriculture and development. Climate scientists studying the region have identified what they call a tipping point. Somewhere around 20–25% deforestation, the entire system could cross a threshold where it can no longer generate its own rainfall, where the closed loop breaks open and the forest begins converting to savanna. Once that happens, there's no going back, and the system that maintained itself for 55 million years would be permanently gone. Breaking up Amazon raises the question of what you actually get. AWS becomes an independent company that's still dominant in cloud and still collecting rent from millions of businesses. Marketplace becomes a platform where most sellers still have to go because that's where the customers are. Prime fragments into streaming and shipping and pharmacy and groceries, split into separate subscriptions that customers now have to manage individually, which isn't competition but inconvenience. Breaking up Amazon doesn't create competitors, and that's what matters most. No alternative ecosystem is waiting to absorb all those sellers, all those customers, and all that data. Companies running on AWS don't suddenly have a better option. Third-party sellers on Marketplace don't have somewhere else to go. And Prime members don't have an alternative that offers the same integration. Force the breakup, and within a decade, the pieces would either remerge or one of them would become the new Amazon, the new climate that everything else has to live inside. Amazon, the company, has no tipping point visible on the horizon. It's still growing, still adding layers, and still tightening its nutrient loops. Every year, more businesses become dependent on AWS, more consumers become locked into Prime, more sellers have no alternative to Marketplace, and more data feeds the algorithms that make the whole system more efficient. When Amazon bought Whole Foods in 2017, it wasn't acquiring a grocery store, but absorbing another organism into the ecosystem. When it acquired MGM, it wasn't just buying content, but strengthening the Prime canopy. When it launched Amazon Pharmacy, it wasn't competing with CVS, but extending the mycorrhizal network into healthcare. Rainforest ecologists figured out millions of years ago what business strategists and regulators are still learning, and it comes down to this. Sustainable dominance doesn't come from being the biggest, but from making yourself the environment that everything else has to live inside. Layered canopy structure, keystone species dynamics, and recruitment limitation aren't separate strategies. They're all expressions of the same principle, which is building a system where your success creates the conditions for your further success and where your removal would collapse the system everyone else depends on. The next time you order something on Amazon, consider whether you're a customer or a nutrient, whether you're making a choice or circulating through a loop that was designed to be self-sustaining. Amazon's critics want it to be evil because that would be easier to fight. You can regulate evil, break up malicious actors, and punish predatory behavior. The problem is that Amazon isn't predatory. It's not hunting competitors or trying to destroy them, but just growing, absorbing, and becoming more integrated, more essential, and more impossible to imagine living without. That's what makes this dangerous. Not dangerous like a predator that might attack you, but dangerous like climate, something that defines the conditions of your existence, whether you want it to or not. The most successful business of the 21st century isn't a company, but an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't compete with organisms. They absorb them. Jeff Bezos didn't study at the Santa Fe Institute and didn't have a background in ecology or complexity theory. Somewhere, though, consciously or unconsciously, he understood something that most business thinkers still don't, which is that the goal isn't to win the game, the goal is to become the game. Amazon isn't a company that grew into a rainforest. It was always being built as one, and the name wasn't metaphor but blueprint. Just like the actual Amazon basin, the question isn't whether it will keep growing. The question is whether anything can grow outside of it anymore, and whether, by the time we realize we should have asked that question earlier, it will already be too late to change the answer.